Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Welcome to Truth in History. I'm Charles Jennings, and with me today in the studio is Pastor Matthew Dyer, and we will be discussing a very important subject. It's a subject that has been debated by many people for many years, and that is the correct and the true identification of God's Israel people in the earth today. Now, in the world of biblical studies, there have been three choices, three viable, what you might call important or prominent choices as to who Israel is today. Number one, the Jews comprise all of Israel, all 12 tribes. That's one belief. The second one is the church is Israel, and the church has been the recipient of all the promises and covenants given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the people of Israel. But are those first two choices correct? The third choice is that the Anglo-Saxon people are Israel. And according to biblical, secular, and historical sources, and many witnesses of ministers, educators, etc., they have shown that this is the correct interpretation and belief as to who Israel is. Pastor Dyer has done extensive research into this area, and he's going to give us several names of men in the past that have believed this. So Pastor Dyer, just go right ahead and share with us.
Yeah, this is a very important subject, and you know, with all these men that we're going to be discussing today, we are not endorsing one denomination or one belief and everything they believe, but rather showing that this truth pierces across denominational lines. And it was believed by people that call themselves Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, and so many others. And the truth was believed by so many different people with different backgrounds. And that's why we should give it a look and take a look at see what these men believed and what they taught. And the first one I want to discuss, and before I talk about him, I want to make a note that, you know, we kind of cherry picked these. It's missing a lot of, or we're overlooking a lot of different people to condense this presentation. So these men that I'm mentioning, they are not the only ones that believed and taught this truth. By the contrary, there's hundreds of different people. But the first one I want to mention is Bernard D. Linton. And most people probably have no idea who that is because it's not a very well-known name. But he is the man that penned the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scottish Declaration of Arbroath. Now, you may have heard that name before. It's often called the Scottish Declaration of Independence. And he penned it for King Robert the Bruce during the Scottish War of Independence between them and England, and sent it to the Pope, declaring that the King Robert the Bruce was their rightful king and their independence from the English power. Now, what's interesting about that document, and it's still around today, the Scottish consider the document to be one of their most precious treasures that they have, comparable to the Declaration of Independence here in the United States. But the document is very interesting because it gives a history of the Scottish people. And I want to read a section of that document here. It says here, quote, "We know, most Holy Father and Lord, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients gather, that among other illustrations, nations, ours, to wit, the nation of the Scots, has been distinguished by many honors, which passing from the greater Scythia through the Mediterranean Sea in the pillars of Hercules, and sojourning in Spain among the most savage tribes, though a long course of time, could nowhere be subdued by any people, however barbarous, and coming hence 1,200 years after the outgoing of the people of Israel, they, by many victories and toils, acquired for themselves the possession in the west, which they now hold in their kingdom, 113 kings of their own royal stock, no stranger, in Verning have reigned. End quote. Now that's very significant because that is a national document, you could say, connecting the Scottish people with the Scythians and the Israel people. And that was not just believed by this one man, but it was penned for Robert the Bruce, and then all the Scottish nobles that signed that document signed it and believed it to be true, at least the man that penned it did. He died in 1331, and that document was created in 1320. So we're not talking about something that just happened in the last 100 years or so. Very significant history, don't you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And another man I want to mention that kind of connects with this history, though, that he wrote a lot of books during his time. That's Jacob Abadie. Now, he was a French Protestant minister, and he had a very successful ministry. He wrote lots of books on different subjects, and he even traveled to Ireland during his time. And he, along with Prince William the Orange of the Province of Orange, and with his Williamite forces, disposed of King James II and his Jacobite armies, and gave much needed relief to the Protestant Christians in Ireland, because they were being heavily persecuted during those times. And that's a whole presentation we could do in itself into that history, but that's not what I want to point out, but rather what he wrote in one of his books. And the book was published in 1723, and it was titled The Triumph of Providence in Religion. And in this book, he identifies the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Scandinavian, and Celtic and Kindred people as the Israel people of the Bible. And I'm going to give you a quote from that book here. Quote, "Certainly, unless the 10 tribes have flown into the air or have plunged to the earth's center, they must be sought in that part of the north which, in the time of Constantine, was converted to the Christian faith, namely among the Iberians, the Armenians, and the Scythians, for that was the place of their dispersion, the wilderness where God caused them to caused them to dwell in tents, as they came out of the land of Egypt." Now, that belief right there is contrary to what most people believe today, but we have two sources, one in the 1300s and one in the 1700s, speaking of this belief. Now, that's very significant because where did they come up with this belief if it's a recent doctrine? And it's not. And that man there, he wrote about it, believed about it, and many other people read and obviously believed it as well. Another man I want to mention, now this man was a Scottish scholar and author, and at the time he compiled and authored one of the only Bible concordances today, or at his time. Today we have hundreds of different types of concordances, but back in the 1700s they did not. Now the man I want to mention is Alexander Cruden. And you may even have one of his concordances in your library because it is still in print today and used often. But I have a copy here from 1900. It is Cruden's Concordance of the Bible. And what is interesting about this book is what he wrote in the second edition, which was published in 1761. And this is not a second edition, but it is a edition that came out later, around 1900, that has this letter in it. And if you have a modern one, it probably does not have this little piece of history in it, unfortunately. But in the dedication letter, in the second edition, he dedicates it to King George, and he says this: "May the great God be the guide of your life, and direct and prosper you, that it may be said that by the present and future ages, that King George III hath been a Hezekiah to our British Israel." Now, at first glance at that, people may not really understand what he's saying there, but he is associating the British Anglo-Saxon people with Israel. Because at that moment in time, there was many people that used this kind of language and belief because they believed they were the physical stock of Israel. And Alexander Crudence is only one of them. And there's evidence of that. There's many other preachers and pastors during the 1700s that believed it and used that kind of language as well. There wasn't until the 1830s that men started really compiling a lot of this history together and making the connection in large volumes of books and lectures. Now, it happened before that, but one man that compiled a book that became very popular during those days in the 1830s and 40s, his name was Reverend John Wilson, and he was a Scottish Presbyterian minister. And in the 1830s, he started doing lectures all throughout England and Scotland and Ireland about the heritage of the Anglo-Saxon people and the Israel people and their connection to it. And in 1840, he took those lectures and he compiled them into a book. And this here's a reprint, but it's a reprint of Our Israelite-ish Origins by John Wilson. Very interesting book, piece of history that we have today. And in this book, he developed the history of the Anglo-Saxon people and connected it to Israel. But the lectures were not just packed with 2 or 3 people. We can look back through newspaper articles and history and find out that they were very well attended by the English people. They were very well received by the English people. And I want to quote a newspaper article from the Leeds Mercury newspaper in West Yorkshire, England on May 22nd, 1847. And it said this about one of John Wilson's lectures. Quote, on Wednesday evening, the last of a course of 4 lectures were delivered by Mr. John Wilson of London on the above subject. The lectures throughout were well attended and from the first increased both in interest and in attendance. The lecturer is evidently a man of deep research and possesses a mind of no mean order, and a manner in which he treated his subject was both novel and interesting. Now, today, you would be hard-pressed to find a media source to write something about that. Back in the day, they were talking about it. It was well known, it was well received. And that was one article mentioned, but there was many different newspaper ads during those days and newspaper articles talking about this movement of people and how this knowledge coming down to the people was well received and attended by many. And isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. It really is. It's a good evidence as to divine revelation as it developed through the centuries.
Absolutely. And we can look at this past history. We can find the men that believed it. We can also look at, evidence like newspaper articles.
Absolutely, yes.
And find out that it wasn't just received by 2 or 3 people. It was well received by many notable people during those times. And that makes it gives a good testimony to us today to look into it.
Often unbelievers will say that this is just a cult that started 50, maybe 75 years ago. Well, this evidence here disproves that. I mean, it really gives evidence that this is truth that's been believed by many people, prominent people, for centuries.
Absolutely. The next man I want to talk about is another most interesting man, and that is Reverend F.E. Pitts, or Reverend Fountain Pitts. Now, this man here, he was a Methodist minister, born in Georgetown, Kentucky, in 1808. And he had been a missionary in Brazil and Argentina for the Methodist Church, and he was ordained as a pastor at like 17 years old. Very interesting. But he had a very exciting life. He was a missionary in Argentina and Brazil, and then when he came back to the States during the war between the North and the South, he was a Confederate chaplain and colonel, and he went on to be a very well-respected Methodist minister during that time. And during the war, he was known as the Fighting Parson. But he, after the war, he came back and he was pastor of the Kindred Church in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's known today as the West End United Methodist Church. It's still there in existence. And he was their first pastor at that church. But what was really interesting is what happened in 1857. He was invited to preach a sermon, 2 sermons in fact, on George Washington's birthday before the United States Congress. And he preached the sermon there before Congress, and it was all about basically an end-time sermon. And the sermon was titled In Defense of Armageddon. Now, what's interesting about the sermon is he identified the American Anglo-Saxon people as the regathered Israel. And that's very interesting because of the attendance he had, the audience that he had. I mean, he preached before Congress. And later, that sermon was published in a book, and I have an original here, In Defense of Armageddon. And this one here was published in 1859, 2 years after his sermons were preached. But I wanted to quote a newspaper article from the Republican Banner in Nashville, Tennessee, from March 10th, 1857, just to give you an idea of how well attended this service was at the United States Congress. This quote, "At the appointed time at 3:00 p.m., it was no easy task to find a seat in the great hall of the Capitol. So deeply interested were the people to hear the sequel of the morning discourse," end quote. Now that's very significant because this man's preached before Congress today. And can you imagine today someone coming before Congress and preaching a sermon that the American people and the people that make up America are regathered Israel? It would be unheard of, but it happened in 1857 and it was well received. And that there just speaks volumes of how it was well received here in America, just like it was over in Britain.
Sure, it was.
And
in Canada.
In Canada, yes. There was a lot of people in Canada that received it, taught it. There was many Canadian preachers that preached this message.
Absolutely. There sure were.
Indeed. But we're going to move back over to England now and talk about a man named Reverend Edward Hyde. Very interesting fellow, too. All these men are interesting. He was born in 1825, and he died in 1891. Now, much like John Wilson, this man his work kind of launched this truth further on into the 1900s. And he wrote a book. His most popular book was written in 1871. And I have a second edition here. It was printed in 1874. And it's The British Nations Identified with Lost Israel. Excellent book. It's still in print today in modern form. And he authored that book, and he came into this truth after listening to a lecture by John Wilson at 15 years old. And even at 15 years old, it must have affected him.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
And teach this message. But according to the 1903 Jewish Almanac, over 250,000 copies of this book here were printed. And that was in 1903, not including the ones that were printed after that. And much like John Wilson, Edward Hyde, he did lectures, and he packed people in to these lecture halls to hear this truth. And we have evidence of those lectures and how they were well received. And I want to quote some more newspaper articles and news reports of those lectures. This one here is from the Sheffield Daily Telegraph in England. And this one here is from 1879. It says here, quote, "Last night a largely attended meeting of the believers in the identity of the British nation with the lost tribes of Israel was held at the Cutler Hall for the formation of the Anglo-Israel Association of Sheffield." Well attended, largely attended. Words like that keep on popping up when we look into this history. I want to read another newspaper article. This is from the Nottingham Daily Guardian of the same time in England. It says here, quote, "The last evening, the lecture room of the Albert Hall, Nottingham, was crowded by an audience who had assembled to listen to a lecture by Mr. Edward Hine entitled The British Nations Identified with the 10 Lost Tribes of the House of Israel. The room was inconveniently crowded, and the chair was occupied by Mr. Fairfield. The lecture, in the course of an interesting and instructive address, referred to the period when the 10 tribes of Israel scattered from the remaining 2, and by a most theoretical and logical argument, showed his audience that as the English nation, the Picts, the Scots, the Saxons, the Danes, and other nations were by historians traced as the coming from the Medes 700 years before Christ. Now that's in the 1870s that this man here was, teaching this, and it was well received.
Well received.
And many people gathered around, and for a man to sell a quarter of a million copies from 1871 to 1903 is significant, even to today's standard.
Oh, yes, absolutely it is.
Then to have people come and gather around all across the countryside to come hear the man speak, and as it says in this article, inconveniently crowded. And even today, we'd have a hard time getting people to come into an inconveniently crowded.
In other words, that's a full house.
A full house, absolutely. And he had a good ministry and received by many, and there was no mean-heartedness about it.
No.
Or anything like that. He was sharing truth to his brethren of the significance that has been lost of the identity of these people.
That's right.
Absolutely. Another man I want to mention is Richard Reeder Harrison. Now, some of you may know who this man is, or at least have heard of him. He was an English Methodist minister, but he also was a counselor to the king and counselor to Queen Victoria. But what he's best known for is being the founder of the Pentecostal League of Prayer in 1891. Now, Mr. Harris, he was an atheist early in life. And this is one thing that I've discovered over doing this research, is finding a lot of atheists or former atheists that were atheists, understood this truth, and then became Christian. And Richard Reeder Harris is just another one of those. And he was an atheist. He didn't believe in the Bible, didn't believe in God. And then he became a Christian, and he connected that becoming a Christian as to understanding that the promises that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, an everlasting covenant, had to be fulfilled today with the people. And he understood that the Jewish people, the modern Jewish Jewry, did not make up those promises. They had not received those promises. They had not become a multitude of nations. They had not become as the sand of the sea or the stars in heaven, comparable to the population, a multitude of people. But he made the connection that the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Scandinavian people did fulfill those promises. And he wrote a book on it in 1907. And like Edward Hine and John Wilson, he lectured on it and became very well known during that time. Mm-hmm. I believe you even wrote about him in your book.
Yes, I did. Richard Reeder Harris was personal friends with Oswald Chambers. And you can buy Oswald Chambers' devotional book today entitled My Utmost for His Highest. And they were personal friends. In fact, when Harris died, Oswald Chambers, it said he grieved, because I read the live story, and he grieved, he wept, and he preached the funeral. So if Richard Reeder Harris knew this truth, no doubt he shared it with many others, including Oswald Chambers.
And I have no doubt that Oswald and probably got a copy of his book.
No doubt.
Which is titled The Lost Tribes of Israel. And this here is a fourth edition, printed in 1920, and it lays out the Anglo-Israel truth in this book. Mm. And I have no doubt that Oswald had a copy of it and had read a copy along with many other people in that time period over there in Egypt.
Yes.
And it's still in print today as well. It's a very good book in the teaching of the Anglo-Israel message. And Richard Reeder Harris, he's well known in many circles today. And like I had said before, he was a counsel to the Queen.
To the Queen.
And that there was no easy position to get.
Yeah.
He was a man of well respect and had he was well known during this time.
And there's indication that Queen Victoria believed this also.
There is. And there's also documented evidence that King George, the mother of Queen Elizabeth,
also believed it.
In fact, there's
yes.
documentation of him writing about that, which is very significant. If Richard had been, counsel to the Queen, I imagine some of those beliefs would have been shared. Maybe that's where it
No doubt.
It's a very interesting history that many people just do not know about. And another man I want to talk about, and this man is comparable to Edward Hyde and John Wilson because his work was so significant in spreading this truth, it's still used today. That's a man named J.H. Allen. And his book was well received by so many people. And he was a Methodist minister. And he was also co-founder of the Church of God Holiness in Missouri. And you can look him up. It was in 1883. But in 1902, he wrote Judah's Scepter and Joseph's Birthright. And this book was, like I said, well distributed during that time and still is today. But this book here, I would say, is probably one of the best books during the early 1900s, laying out this truth in one complete volume without any different booklets.
Yes.
It's comparable to Edward Hyde's work. And as you read these books, you can see how the information was progressing. They were finding information and then building upon other people's in the past information, just like we do today.
Oh, yeah.
Any kind of historical information or even biblical doctrine.
Well, J.H. Allen and his daughter went to Great Britain, and they went to some historical houses that kept all the records of the royal family. And they recorded, when they got back, they wrote an article, how they saw the charts, the genealogical charts of the royal house of Great Britain, at that time, Queen Victoria, and how she traced her ancestry all the way back to the biblical king, King David.
Correct. And I believe there was a man by the name of Colonel Growler, that he was the keeper of the crown jewels.
Yes.
He wrote some books as well on the lineage of the royal house.
Yes, he did.
Just as a side, another interesting man.
Yeah.
But one thing about J.H. Allen is his book was well received, but we have documentation of it. I want to read one quote here, and this is from the Baptist Messenger. And this is a Baptist publication still in print today. And this is from the early, I think in 1919. But it says here, quote, "This is one of the most interesting volumes we have read in many a day. And we confess the argument produced by Mr. Allen seemed to be unanswerable. It is more thrilling than a Western fiction. The description of the scarlet thread, the royal remnant, and the part played by Jeremiah in the preservation of the ruler for David's throne will cause you to lose sleep rather than go to bed without knowing the outcome."
Yeah.
That's the Baptist Messenger.
Yeah.
And J.H. Allen was not a Baptist. He was a Methodist.
A Methodist. Yeah.
And yet, like I said at the beginning, this truth pierces across denominational lines and is accepted by many. And there's a lot of other newspaper articles and reports, much like the other men we talked about. J.H. Allen traveled all over the country and with the British Israel World Federation and other organizations at the time, speaking at conferences and gatherings. This truth, they were well received, well attended, and a lot of different people. And very, very good information. And so many people overlook the fact that these truths have been around for such a long time. And another man I want to talk about, he's born in 1877. And I know me and you both really enjoyed his work.
Oh, yes.
Just a very interesting fellow. And that's F.F. Bosworth, or Fred Francis Bosworth. And along with some other people, you may have heard him and know who we're talking about, because he's well known today for his book on divine healing called Christ the Healer. And
Yes.
I don't know how many millions of copies it's been printed.
It's the classic book written, I think, in 1925 concerning the principle or the truth of divine healing. And it is still being printed today and read by thousands of people.
It is, and it's an excellent book. And there's a lot of history on how that book even came to be that we can't go into today, but just an excellent book. But like I said, you could get his book on divine healing, and you may have it all written. But what many do not know about F.F. Bosworth is he was a strong believer and teacher in the Anglo-Israel truth. And people that do know this, some people overlook it on purpose, unfortunately. And he had a weekly, or I don't know if it's weekly or daily radio program.
Out of Chicago.
And he taught this truth. And one of his sermons that he preached on that program was the differences between the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
Yes.
And the biblical differences.
Yes.
The title of it. And that was later printed in booklet form, and it was distributed and still distributed today.
Yes, it is.
Lesson. And he had a large following, big ministry.
Oh.
So not surrounding just around the Anglo-Israel truth, but others. And you wrote about him in your book.
Yes. F.F. Bosworth had a miraculous healing when he was a young man in Fitzgerald, Georgia. And he was prayed for by a lady by the name of Maddie Perry. And then he went up to Zion, Illinois with Dr. Dowie there, and he was, I think, the band director and so forth. But he became what we call a healing evangelist. And he was very prominent. I mean, he held some of the largest healing revivals in the United States and Canada in his day. And then he became a mentor to evangelist William Branham. So he was very prominent. And some people say, well, Bosworth denounced. You hear some people say that he denounced the Anglo-Israel truth, but that is not correct, because Curtis Clare Ewing, who died not too many years ago, was personal friends with Bosworth, and he reported that he talked to F.F. Bosworth not long before Brother Bosworth died, and Brother Bosworth said, I still believe the Anglo-Israel truth. So there's witness from Curtis Clare Ewing that Bosworth, he believed it to the day that he died.
And the one thing that's interesting to note about those that claim that Bosworth denounced it is they have no proof.
They have no proof whatsoever.
I've read the books of, there's one man, I can't recall his name, he wrote on it, and he made that statement. And there was no documentation,
no
footnote or anything like that. So it was made up.
It was made up.
And that's unfortunate.
And Curtis Clare Ewing, I knew him. I knew Curtis Clare Ewing.
And he was a well-known teacher and believer.
Yes, he was.
Author of many books and tracts, literature.
Wonderful writer.
And he's testimony to Bosworth's belief in it. Now, another thing that, and I didn't even know this till not that long ago, is F.F. Bosworth once a week would hand over his microphone to his radio show to Howard B. Rand, which was a very prominent man during the time, big author.
Oh, yes.
He was a lawyer, and he was the head of the Anglo-Saxon Federation of America, which organized different groups and published different books. And he was also the editor of Destiny magazine, which was a Anglo-Israel magazine.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes.
But he would hand over the microphone to Howard Rand. They lived in the same city.
Yeah.
And Howard Rand, they would promote the Anglo-Israel message together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just fascinating
Yes.
for me, because it ties all these people in together, and in a way that people don't realize it.
No.
You know, most people would even know who Bosworth is, have no idea that he was associated with these people and believe this and this truth, because it wasn't a message of hate or discrimination. It was a message of Bible truth.
Bible truth.
And making what God said all the way back in Genesis 17, the promises he made to Abraham, they're true today.
They're true today.
And Bosworth understood this. Howard Rand, Edward Heim, and
many others
opened up the Bible to him. And his truth has been associated as like key in Scripture, because it opens up. Because you cannot read the Bible here and understand anything about it without first understanding who it was written to and what the purpose is. Much like if you had a manual to a computer, and if you had the wrong manual to that computer, you're lost. It's nonsense.
That's right.
And these men understood that. But one thing about S.F. Bosworth, and you've wrote about this in your book as well, is his association with more people that preach this truth. And we don't know 100% sure where he learned this truth, but we're pretty confident that he learned it from John Alexander Dowie.
Possibly, yes.
Zion, Arizona, Illinois.
Most likely.
Or someone there in the community. Because as you wrote in your book, Who Hath Believed Our Report, John Alexander Dowie believed it and preached it. And
in fact, I have a quote right here. I mean, he, out of his magazine, Leaves of Healing, there's a lot of quotes, but just this short one. This is what Dowie said. June 28th, 1902. He said, I hold to the Israelitish origin of the Anglo-Saxon race. That's pretty clear.
That is pretty clear. And then we know from history that Bosworth went to from Fitzgerald, Georgia to Zion, and then we also know that many other people came out or were associated in Zion, Illinois, of the Anglo-Israel message, like John G. Lake.
John G. Lake.
And Parrow.
Yeah. John G. Lake is the man, many of you are familiar with that name. He was healed, his wife was healed, his sister was healed miraculously under the ministry of Dr. Dowie, and he went to South Africa and evangelized, and you can read his books today of the many miracles that took place in his ministry. Then he came back to Spokane and opened up what he called healing homes. So that makes it, that kind of brings it up to our day, that he believed this message. And we've known people that actually knew him. And he affirmed the fact that he believed it. Absolutely.
And that's so significant, because so many people came out of Zion with this truth, and they spread it like wildfire.
Absolutely.
And Charles Parham was another one that was associated with those people and knew those people, and he believed it as well.
He believed it. He learned it from J.H. Allen, the Methodist preacher.
And I believe he even had meetings there in Zion too.
Yes, I think it was after.
It was after
Dr. Dowie was dead.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some more connections.
More connections. Yeah.
Different people. Because if you have a truth like this, any truth, what do you do as a Christian?
Yeah.
You tell people. You share, because you want your brethren to understand the same thing that you understand.
Yes. It's like salvation. It's not just for the Methodist or the Baptist or the Pentecostals. Salvation is for everyone.
It's for anyone that believes
Yes.
Jesus Christ in this book, and so many people misunderstand that.
Yes.
It is a truth for everybody. And another man I want to bring up, he was born in the same year as F.F. Bosworth, and that's Dr. Mordecai Ham. And many of you may know exactly who that is, or at least heard of him, or, may ring a bell. And he was born in Kentucky, another Kentucky preacher there. And he was born in 1877, and he was a Baptist minister. And he is well known for, he's like circuit riding preacher.
Oh, yeah.
They traveled around, and I don't think it's a coincidence. Many of the preachers that preach this truth are circuit riding preachers.
Oh, yeah.
Travel around. And he's well known for having a tent revival in North Carolina, and Billy Graham was converted under his ministry.
Yes, he was.
1934. And that's what he's well known for. So, but what many people do not know is he believed and taught the Anglo-Israel message. And that is significant. He was even invited to the British Israel World Federation in 1926, the seventh annual one. They have these big conferences over there in Britain, and different ministers from all over the globe would come, and they would do addresses and share new truths and have sermons, and just a big old get-together of sharing this truth. And this is a quote from that sermon. The Need of the Anglo-Israel Truth was the title of that message. And he said this in that quote. And I know of no truth today that can so restore confidence as this Anglo-Israel truth. Because in my country, in the Southland of America, you find the old Anglo-Saxon Puritan blood in ascendancy. We still believe this book in spite of all the attacks that are being made upon it. End quote. What a good quote. I mean,
wonderful.
Absolutely. So he understood this truth, so like many others. And he had connections with a lot of big people, not saying they believed it or not, but they had at least heard it, and they knew what they believed. And we find that with a lot of people that we're talking about here.
I had a pastor, Fred Gabler, who was ordained by Dr. Ham. And Fred Gabler was also a believer in the Anglo-Israel truth. So there's a lot of connections going way back. This has been a truth that has been revealed to so many people that it would be impossible for us to find documentation or find their name or, to list them, to number them. There are tens of thousands of people that have believed this. So anyone that comes up with the idea, well, it's just a cult that was started by one man and he had a lot of funny ideas and, that's not true. So, let's be honest. Let's be intellectually honest and biblically honest and face the fact that church history itself proves that the Anglo-Saxon people and related families are the true physical, visible descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's not been hidden except by those who don't believe it, those that want to push it under the carpet, so to speak, and hide it. But I know a church historian that told me that he has all types of books on Pentecostal history, but he said there's a big gap in that history. And that gap has been made intentionally by Pentecostal historians who have just refused to put it in history books. But he said, I want you to fill in that gap. And the gap is so many Pentecostals, Baptists, Methodists, etc., believe this wonderful truth.
Indeed. And there's a lot of Baptists that believed it, a lot of Methodists, a lot of Episcopalian and Presbyterian, but there was a large group of Pentecostal.
Absolutely.
maybe larger than all of them, is very significant.
Yeah.
And that may be responsible for so many people in one area spreading it, like with anxiety.
Yes.
But it's no doubt that there's a lot of Pentecostal ministers, big name people.
Oh, yeah, big names.
That believed it and taught.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very significant in there.
I know a man by the name of Clem Humbard. He was Rex Humbard's brother, younger brother. He believed it. I talked to him. I talked about this. In fact, he even wrote an article for one of my magazines entitled The Outstretched Arms or Wings. And so he was very prominent. And so did his brother Rex know it? I don't know. I never really asked him. But Clement believed it.
Indeed. Two other men I want to mention that I love reading about them, and I want to find out more about their ministry because they had a big ministry, but they weren't very well known today. And it's Paul Rader and Luke Rader.
Yes.
Two brothers. And Paul, his first name was Daniel, but he went by, it's known by Paul.
Yes.
And he was born in 1879, and his brother Luke was born in 1890.
And I might mention one thing about Paul Rader. He wrote the chorus, Only Believe, in 1925. He wrote the chorus that has been used widely, especially through the Pentecostal and charismatic movements. Go right ahead.
That's interesting. I did not know that. They were both two big evangelists. They were like the other men, kind of circuit riding preachers. They did some traveling. I know Paul, he had a brass band, chorus band that he used with his ministry, and but sadly they're not very well known, even among Pentecostal and other charismatic groups. But they traveled all over, and they had a very successful ministry in Chicago.
Yes,
big ministry. In fact, Paul, they said that over 2,000 people a night would come. This is obviously before television. Because it'd be hard to get that many people in one building and enjoy it. But 2,000 people at night come to his gatherings there in Chicago and listen to him preach and the worship service there. But really interesting history is on June 3rd, 1922, and this is radio history, in fact. He was invited by the mayor of Chicago to come onto the roof of their new radio station. WBU was the new radio station.
Yeah.
Now, radio technology was new, and he invited him to come up there and preach a sermon. And they had his band, and they played, and I don't know if that's the first time a preacher went up there, but I know it was one of the first.
One of the first.
Because radio the first commercial radio station was in 1920. So you're only in November of 1920. So you're only talking a little bit under 2 years. But he went up on the building in this little plywood hut and preached a sermon. They made a makeshift microphone out of an old telephone and gave some headphones, and he preached a sermon, and very interesting history. And in 1925, the mayor of Chicago asked him to come back, and they signed a contract for him to preach 15 hours of preaching a week. And I'm sure that included music as well, but 15 hours of preaching a week and Christian radio services for 10 years. So it was a contract, you do this for 10 years. And he did. And anyway, what many people don't know about this man is he believed and taught the Anglo-Israel truth along with his brother Luke, and wrote booklets and were very well known. And one of the books that Luke wrote was The Lost Key to the Old Testament Found. And I believe you even mentioned that in your book too.
Yes.
About these two men.
Yes, I did.
And in this booklet, he lays out the Anglo-Israel message and the importance of it. And like I mentioned earlier, he associates it with a key of unlocking the scriptures and understanding who they were written to. And they were also friends with F.F. Bosworth. more of those connections.
Yes, they were.
And Bosworth held a meeting in their church in Chicago a couple times, a healing meeting, and they were friends, and they knew each other. And
they were also friends with George Bennard, the man who wrote The Old Rugged Cross.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See more of those connections.
More connections all the time.
And another widely known man that believed this was George Jeffreys.
Absolutely.
And he founded the Elam Pentecostal Church. Is that correct?
In Great Britain.
Yes.
Yes, he did.
Another man that believed it in that denomination, and many people don't know about it.
Yeah.
Clem Davies was another one.
Yeah, well, George Jeffreys' brother, Stephen, also believed it. And they preached, well, Stephen, he came to America and preached. But those were powerful, powerful ministries because they were saved in the Welsh revival of 1904, 1905. So there's a lot of connections, and it's just, we could not list the number of men that believe this in the U.S. and also in Great Britain.
And I've tried. I've been compiling these different names, and like I had said at the beginning, it was hard to pick the cream of it.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're all very interesting people.
Absolutely.
Many of them well known, and they believed it, taught books. And one thing I found is the more I keep looking for names and ministers and people that believed it, taught it, keep on finding them.
Yeah.
You know, not just in America and Great Britain. We have South Africa.
Oh, yes.
Australia,
oh, yes.
And many other countries, going back hundreds of years.
Oh, yeah.
All over Europe in that area there. And such a rich history.
Well, William Cathcart was a man that, he was Scottish, and long story made short, he came to America in his old age, but he was telling us, and I was under his ministry for years, he told us he was a World War I veteran. He was healed, saved. The Lord called him to go to Australia, and he founded 40 Pentecostal churches in Australia. And he was also a believer in the Anglo-Israel message, and he took that down there. So the original Pentecostal movement in Australia was Anglo-Israel.
And many, even on Australia to this day, probably have no idea about that. Even of the William Cathcart?
Probably not.
Probably have no idea who he is.
Yeah.
And that's very unfortunate. And you wrote about him in your book.
Oh, yeah. I mentioned him because we knew him personally.
Yes. Much history.
Yeah.
And I recently wrote a track titled The Anglo-Israel Truth, Is It a New Doctrine? And it is a condensed version of what we talked about today. And I mentioned many other history and historical evidence and preachers in this track that we did not mention today. And if you would like to read that, you can go to my website at the bottom of the screen, and you can read that. And at the bottom of that track, I have a more complete list of these preachers and teachers and adherents that believe this truth, and their names with some of the works that they did, the books and documentation that we have that they believe this truth. And I believe your latest magazine is kind of along the same line.
Yes. Pastor Dyer has written an article in our latest magazine entitled Preachers of the Anglo-Israel Truth. And he named some of the ones that he talked about today, and then some others. But if you have never received our magazine, Truth and History magazine, there is no subscription price for this magazine. We'll send it to you free of charge. And we'll also send you a copy of the tract that Pastor Dyer has written, Anglo-Israel Truth, Is It a New Doctrine? So they kind of go together, and we will send it. You can call our telephone number. You can write to us. Send us an email, because this is an extremely important subject to know and to understand. And many people have told me when they learned this, the Bible became a brand new book, you know. You might mention the fact of your YouTube channel.
Yes, I do have a YouTube channel under Christian America Ministries, and I have an ongoing series there regarding the Anglo-Israel truth, and each video I try to touch on a different aspect of it, maybe a different objection, different question, and touch on that. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to reach out to me at my website, send it to me, we'll do a video on it. And
well, we also have a YouTube channel, Truth and History, and there are others. I have a friend in Australia. He has a YouTube channel also entitled "Hast Thou Not Heard?" And his name is Carl Tester. Carl is spelled with a K. But this is not a truth that's in a corner somewhere. It's been broadcast for hundreds of years by many, many different people through ministry, public ministry, books, etc. The only time it's in a corner is when theologians suppress it and try to get it out of the way. And then they demonize it or try to demonize it. But folks, we are believers in not only the Anglo-Israel truth, but we are believers in the blood of Christ, that Jesus Christ is our only means of salvation. You could be an Israelite, but you need to be born again. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. That was Israel, but we're also lost, depraved human beings, and we need the blood of Jesus in our cover our lives and our hearts, and you know, forgive us of our sins. So we are genuine Christian people. Now, I want to emphasize before we go, if you would like a copy of this magazine, which is free of charge, and the tract to go with it, we'll send it to you, because we believe what Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And we appreciate what the pastor has given us today, and we believe that Jesus Christ is coming back to rule over the house of Jacob forever. God bless you.
The presentation that you just watched was one that was done by Pastor Charles Jennings and myself about 3 years ago. Unfortunately, when we recorded it, after the recording was done, there was a corruption with the audio and video file, and him and I thought it was lost completely. And we thought it was just shelved. We didn't find out until after I went home. I had traveled up to Oklahoma to record it. And we were both very disappointed, but thankfully we were able to recover the contents of it, and it's pretty much intact completely, other than every now and then you will hear my mic cut out a little bit. That was the only issue that I wasn't able to correct. And in that presentation, we discussed the messengers of the Anglo-Israel truth, those who have taught and believed the Anglo-Israel message. And since that broadcast, or that recording, I wrote a book, 160-some page book, titled The Anglo-Israel Messengers, a history of those who have believed and taught that the Anglo-Saxon and Kindred people are Israel. And I would highly recommend you get this book if you want to learn more. All the people that we mentioned in this presentation are in here, along with well over 100 more, hundreds of years of history, and it's well illustrated with newspaper articles and pictures of all these different people, and documentation of their works and their beliefs and the things they did and who they are.
and newspaper articles of different conferences and meetings and tent revivals that they had, and just a lot of information. It took me about 3 years to put this book together. I was working on it at the time of the presentation, and I'm currently working on the second edition of the book. Now, I don't know when that will be done, but it is already, this was 160 pages. The second edition is already to 200 pages, and I really think it's going to be probably double the size, so somewhere around 300 pages. And I'm going to, as long as I'm still alive, continue to document this history and be a historian of the Anglo-Israel message and those who have believed and taught it. And there's a lot of information around there. Every time I turn around, I'm finding somebody else that believed it and taught it and wrote a book on it. And I try to find their book. A lot of the books behind me on my bookshelf are authors that believe the Anglo-Israel message and taught on it. So anyone out there that says that nobody's ever taught on this, or this obscure teaching, nobody of real importance has ever documented it or really put scholarly material out there, they are uninformed. They do not know what they're talking about. I have hundreds of books in my library, old books. I'm not just talking about new books. There are new books, but hundreds of titles on the Israel message. And I wanted to kind of give you a preview of some of the people that you're going to read about in my book that was not mentioned in this broadcast. And one of them here is Reverend Joseph Wilde. He wrote this book here. This was published in 1882. It is titled The Lost 10 Tribes, and he gives a basic Anglo-Israel message argument here in this book. Another man here, Reverend James Mountain. Now, he is one of my favorite people mentioned in the book. Mr. James Mountain was an atheist, and then he converted to Christianity after he learned the Israel message. He was involved in the German rationalist movement over in Germany, and he had pretty much just throughout Christianity altogether, the Scriptures, and then he converted after learning about how the promises really were meant for Israel. And he wrote many books. This one here is The Triumph of British Israel. This one here was published in 1930. And there's many books that he wrote. He wrote many articles and books over the years. And then there's this book here, massive 800-page book on the Israel message. Now, I don't know for sure, but this is probably one of the larger volumes on the Israel message out there, written by Adam Rutherford. And this is one that he worked on for many years. It started out in a smaller volume, and then he just kept growing till this is its final state. And that is the Anglo-Saxon Israel by Adam Rutherford, 800 pages. And then there's A Lost People and a Vanished Scepter by George O. Barnes. He was a pastor from Kentucky, another Kentucky evangelist pastor. And he wrote that book. And then this one here was published in 1985. And it is Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets by biblical archaeologist E. Raymond Capp. Now, this is obviously a newer one compared to the ones that I just showed you. We have Joseph Wilde there in 1882. And even in 1985, over 100 years later, books are still being written and published on this subject. This is one of the best when it comes to the archaeology and the historical evidence for the Anglo-Israel message. It's still available, it's still in print, and I highly recommend anyone out there wanting to learn more about this truth to get a hold of this book here. Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets by biblical archaeologist E. Raymond Capp. And those are just a few of the people and books that are mentioned in this book, Anglo-Israel Messengers, a history of those who have taught that the Anglo-Saxon and Kindred people are Israel. And you can get a copy at my website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, or you can also get it on Amazon as well. And Lord willing, in a couple years, I'll have a second edition out, and maybe, who knows, a couple years after that, maybe even a third edition or another book entirely on the subject. So I plan to continue documenting this history. That way we can know where we came from, who believed this message, and teach it to our children and those who question about and say that the Israel message is only something recently invented by Richard Brothers or Armstrong or whoever. But this is a very important history that we need to teach our people.